I never thought I would be telling this story out loud, but here I am, speaking into the void and hoping someone hears me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Sometimes just knowing that someone out there understands makes all the difference. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe. It helps me feel less alone. Now, let me tell you what happened the day my husband walked into my hospital room carrying flowers that weren't meant for me. The morning started like any other morning in that sterile hospital room. I had been there for 6 days, 6 long days of fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, of nurses who came in every few hours to check my vitals, of the smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. The blinds were halfway open, and through them I could see a slice of gray November sky. The trees outside were bare, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching towards nothing. I was recovering from emergency surgery, an appendectomy that had gone badly. What should have been a simple procedure had turned into something more complicated when the infection spread. They had to open me up wider, clean out the poison, and stitch me back together like a torn piece of fabric. My name is Elena. I was 34 years old then. I had been married to Richard for 9 years. We had no children, though I had wanted them desperately. Richard always said later, maybe next year, when things are more stable. Things were never stable enough. He worked in finance, something to do with hedge funds and investments that I never fully understood. He wore expensive suits and came home late smelling of cologne and ambition. I worked as a librarian at the county library, a job I loved for its quietness, for the way books lined up like loyal soldiers, for the smell of old paper and possibility. The hospital room was small. There was a single bed with rails on the side, a chair upholstered in pale blue vinyl that had a long crack down the middle, a television mounted high on the wall that I never turned on, and a narrow window that looked out onto the parking lot. I had been alone most of the time. Richard had visited once, the day after my surgery. He had stayed for 20 minutes, his phone buzzing constantly in his pocket, his eyes darting to the door as if he were waiting for permission to leave. He told me he had important meetings, that he would come back soon, that I should rest and not worry about anything. Then he was gone, and I was left with the silence and the pain that bloomed in my abdomen every time I tried to move. My mother had called several times. She lived 4 states away, and her health was not good enough for travel. My father had passed 3 years earlier. I had a few friends, but they were busy with their own lives, their own children, their own husbands who actually showed up. I told myself that Richard was busy, that he was working hard to pay the medical bills, that his absence was a form of love in its own way. I told myself many lies in those days. On the 6th day, a Thursday, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. It was mid-morning, maybe 10 o'clock. I had already been awoken at 6 for blood work, had already eaten the bland breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard, had already taken my pain medication, and drifted in and out of a gray half-sleep. The rain was steady, not heavy but persistent, the kind of rain that made the world feel smaller and more closed in. I was sitting up in bed, trying to read a novel I had brought from home, but the words kept sliding off the page. My mind was foggy from the medication and the pain and the loneliness that had settled into my bones. I heard footsteps in the hallway, confident footsteps, the kind that belong to someone who knows exactly where they are going. I looked up, and there was Richard. He was wearing a dark gray suit, the one I had always thought made him look particularly handsome. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a shine. In his hands, he carried a massive bouquet of flowers, roses, lilies, orchids, all arranged in an explosion of color and beauty. My heart lifted. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a relief so profound it almost made me cry. He had come. He had brought me flowers. He was sorry for being absent. He loved me after all. I smiled. I actually smiled. I think I even started to say something grateful and soft. But then I saw his face. He was not looking at me. His eyes scanned the room, and then he walked right past my bed. He did not stop. He did not pause. He walked past me as if I were part of the furniture, as if I were another piece of medical equipment cluttering the space. He went to the door, opened it, and leaned out into the hallway. I heard a voice, a woman's voice, light and musical, the kind of voice that belongs in a perfume commercial. She said something I could not quite make out, and Richard laughed. It was a laugh I had not heard in years, genuine and unguarded. He stepped back into the room, and she followed him. She was younger than me, maybe late 20s. She had long blonde hair that cascaded over her shoulders in perfect waves, the kind of hair that requires effort and expensive products. She wore a white blouse and black slacks, stylish and professional. Her face was beautiful in a way that made my stomach twist. Delicate features, bright blue eyes, a smile that seemed to light up the room. Richard handed her the flowers. She took them with both hands, her face glowing with delight. She buried her face in the blooms and breathed in deeply, then looked up at Richard with an expression of such pure adoration that I felt something inside me crack. He put his hand on her back, guiding her toward the chair where I had imagined he might sit and hold my hand and tell me everything would be okay. She sat down, arranging the flowers on her lap, and Richard stood beside her, his hand still resting on her shoulder. I was frozen. I could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. The pain medication made everything feel distant and surreal, as if I were watching a scene from a movie that I had accidentally wandered into. Richard finally looked at me. His expression was neutral, almost bored. He said, "Elena, this is Vanessa. Vanessa, this is my wife, Elena." Vanessa looked at me for the first time. Her smile did not falter. She said, "Oh, hi. Richard has told me so much about you." Her voice was sweet, dripping with a kind of false sympathy that made my skin crawl. She gestured to the flowers. "Aren't these gorgeous? Richard is so thoughtful. I had a little dizzy spell this morning, nothing serious, but he insisted on bringing me here to get checked out, and then he surprised me with these. He is just the best." I stared at her. I stared at the flowers. I stared at Richard. The room tilted. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, harsher, until they were painful to look at. I heard a ringing in my ears, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Richard said something else, something about Vanessa working in his office, about her being his assistant, about how she had been feeling faint, and he did not want to take any chances. His words were casual, matter-of-fact, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Vanessa stood up and set the flowers on the small table beside my bed. They took up all the space, their colors vibrant and almost obscene against the dull hospital surroundings. She said, "Well, I should probably go find a nurse. Thanks for the ride, Richard." She touched his arm, a lingering touch, her fingers trailing down his sleeve, and then she walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Richard watched her go. Then he turned to me, and for the first time, he seemed to remember that I was there. He said, "I have to get back to work. I just wanted to make sure she was okay." He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if I needed anything. He did not apologize or explain or acknowledge the insanity of what had just happened. He simply turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the flowers that smelled like betrayal. I sat there for a long time. I do not know how long. The rain continued to tap against the window. A nurse came in at some point and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head. She left. I stared at the flowers. They were beautiful. They were perfect. They were not for me. I reached out and touched one of the roses. The petals were soft, velvety. I pulled my hand back as if I had been burned. The truth settled over me slowly like dust. It was not a sudden realization. It was a gradual understanding that had been building for months, maybe years, and I had been too afraid or too stupid to see it. Richard was having an affair. The woman, Vanessa, was his mistress, and he had brought her to the hospital where I was recovering from surgery, had brought her flowers, had paraded her in front of me as if I did not matter, as if I were already gone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the flowers across the room, to tear the petals into pieces, to smash the vase against the wall. But I did not. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping the thin hospital blanket, my mind spinning in circles. I thought about all the late nights, all the missed dinners, all the times he had been distant and distracted. I thought about the way he had stopped touching me, stopped kissing me, stopped looking at me as if I were someone worth seeing. I thought about the way I had made excuses for him, had told myself that he was just stressed, just busy, just tired. I had been so desperate to believe in the life we had built together that I had ignored every sign, every red flag, every moment that screamed the truth. I discharged myself from the hospital 2 days later, against medical advice. The nurses tried to convince me to stay, told me I needed more time to heal, that I was at risk for complications. I signed the forms, got dressed in the clothes my mother had sent via overnight delivery, and walked out into the cold November air. I took a taxi home. The house was empty. Richard was at work, or so I assumed. I walked through the rooms, seeing them as if for the first time. The living room with its leather furniture and abstract art on the walls. The kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. The bedroom with its king-sized bed and the closet that held Richard's expensive suits and my modest dresses. Everything was clean, orderly, expensive. Everything was hollow. I went into the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a ghost. My skin was pale, my eyes sunken, my hair limp and unwashed. I had lost weight. My clothes hung on me like they belonged to someone else. I touched my face, traced the lines around my eyes, the hollow of my cheeks. I did not recognize the woman staring back at me. I did not know who she was or what she was supposed to do next. I spent the next few days moving through the house like a shadow. I slept in the guest room. Richard came home late, if he came home at all. When he was there, he was distant, locked in his office or on his phone. We did not speak. I did not confront him. I did not have the energy, the courage, the words. I was still healing from the surgery, still taking pain medication, still moving slowly and carefully to avoid tearing the stitches. I felt like a wounded animal, hiding in a corner, waiting for the predator to lose interest and move on. One evening, about a week after I had left the hospital, I was sitting in the living room when Richard came home. It was late, after 9. He walked in, loosening his tie, and saw me sitting there in the dark. He flicked on the light, and I squinted against the sudden brightness. He said, "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I did not answer. I just looked at him. He sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested I was being difficult, that I was being unreasonable. He said, "We need to talk." I nodded. I knew what was coming. I had known it from the moment he walked into that hospital room with flowers meant for someone else. He sat down in the chair across from me, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with an expression that might have been pity or might have been annoyance. He said, "Elena, this is not working. You know it. I know it. We have been going through the motions for years. I think it is time we admit that we are not happy." I said, "You mean you are not happy?" He shrugged. "Neither of us is happy. Look at us. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time we laughed together, enjoyed each other's company? We are like roommates. We are like strangers. I said, "We are married," he said. And that is the problem. We got married too young. We did not know what we wanted. I have changed. You have changed. We want different things now. I said, "What do you want, Richard?" He looked away. He said, "I want a life that feels alive. I want passion. I want someone who understands me, who challenges me, who makes me feel like the best version of myself." I said, "Someone like Vanessa." He looked back at me, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe just relief that the secret was finally out. He said, "Yes, someone like Vanessa." I said, "How long?" He said, "Does it matter?" I said, "Yes, it matters." He sighed again. He said, 8 months. 8 months. I felt the air leave my lungs. 8 months of lies, of betrayal, of him coming home and kissing me on the cheek and pretending everything was fine. 8 months of me believing that we were a team, that we were partners, that we were building a future together. I said, "And you brought her to the hospital. You brought her flowers. You brought her to the place where I was lying in bed, recovering from surgery, and you paraded her in front of me like I was nothing." He said, "That was not my intention. She really did feel faint. I was just trying to help." I laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound. I said, "You were trying to help her. What about me? What about your wife, lying in a hospital bed, alone in pain, wondering why you could not be bothered to visit?" He said, "I did visit. I was there the day after your surgery." I said, "For 20 minutes. You stayed for 20 minutes, and then you left, and you did not come back." He stood up. He said, "I do not want to fight about this. I came here to tell you that I want a divorce. I think it is the best thing for both of us. We can do this civilly, work out the details, and move on with our lives." I said, "Move on with your life, you mean move on with Vanessa?" He said, "Yes. If you want to know the truth, yes. I love her, Elena. I am sorry, but I do. And I deserve to be happy." I said, "And what about me? Do I not deserve to be happy?" He said, "Of course you do. That is why I am doing this. So we can both be happy." I stared at him. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was selfish and cruel and cowardly. I wanted to tell him that he had destroyed me, that he had taken everything I believed in and shattered it into a million pieces. But I did not. I just nodded. I said, "Okay." He looked surprised, as if he had expected more of a fight. He said, "Okay?" I said, "Yes, okay. You want a divorce? We will get a divorce." He said, "I will have my lawyer draw up the papers. We can split everything fairly. The house, the savings, everything." I said, "Fine." He left the room. I heard him go upstairs, heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of clothes being packed. He came back down with a suitcase. He said, "I am going to stay at a hotel for now. I will be in touch." And then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and I was alone in the house that no longer felt like a home. I sat there in the silence, listening to the sound of my own breathing, feeling the ache in my abdomen where they had cut me open and put me back together. I felt like I was falling, like the ground had disappeared beneath me, and I was tumbling through empty space with nothing to hold on to. The next few weeks were a blur. Richard's lawyer sent over the divorce papers. I read through them in the dim light of the guest room. Everything was outlined in cold, clinical language. The division of assets, the terms of the settlement, the date the marriage would officially end. I was entitled to half of the savings, which amounted to about $40,000. The house would be sold and the proceeds split. I would keep my car, he would keep his. I would keep my personal belongings, he would keep his. It was all very neat, very tidy, very final. I signed the papers. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not fight for more. I did not have the energy. I was still recovering physically, and emotionally I was a wreck. I went to work at the library, moving through the motions, shelving books, checking out patrons, answering questions. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, spoke when I was supposed to speak, but inside, I was hollow. I was a shell of a person, going through the routines of a life that no longer made sense. I told no one about the divorce at first. I could not bear to say the words out loud. My mother called, and I lied, told her everything was fine, that Richard was busy, but we were doing well. My friends called and I made excuses, said I was tired, that I was still recovering, that I would see them soon. I isolated myself, retreated into a cocoon of silence and shame. I felt like a failure. I felt like I had done something wrong, like I had not been enough, like I had driven him away by being boring or needy or insufficient in some fundamental way. The house sold quickly. It was a good house in a good neighborhood, and the market was strong. Richard and I met once more at the lawyer's office to sign the final documents. He looked good. He looked happy. His face had a glow to it, the glow of someone who had been released from a prison they did not even know they were in. I looked at him and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast emptiness. We did not speak beyond the formalities. He signed, I signed. The lawyer notarized everything, shook our hands, and that was it. 9 years of marriage ended in a conference room with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed the same way the hospital lights had hummed. Richard left first. I sat there for a moment, staring at the papers, at my signature next to his, at the words that declared us legally separated, no longer bound by the promises we had made in front of family and friends and God. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was a 1-bedroom place in an old building with thin walls and creaky floors. The rent was cheap, which was good because I did not have much money. After the house sale and the division of assets, I had enough to cover a few months of living expenses, but not much more. I furnished the apartment with second-hand furniture, a couch from a thrift store, a bed from a yard sale, a table and chairs that someone had left on the curb. I tried to make it feel like home, but it felt like exactly what it was, a place where broken things ended up. I continued working at the library. It was the one constant in my life, the one place where I felt like I had some purpose. I loved the quiet, the order, the way stories lined the shelves, waiting to be discovered. I loved helping people find the books they needed, the books that would take them away from their own lives for a little while. I threw myself into my work, took on extra shifts, volunteered to organize events and book clubs. It was a way to fill the hours, to keep my mind occupied, to avoid sitting alone in my apartment and thinking about everything I had lost. One evening, about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I was closing up the library. It was late, after 8, and the building was empty. I was locking the front doors when I saw a man standing on the sidewalk. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. He wore a long coat and carried a leather satchel. He smiled at me and said, "Excuse me, are you Elena?" I froze. I did not know this man. I said, "Yes. Can I help you?" He said, "My name is David Brennan. I am a lawyer. I represent the estate of Margaret Clausen. I have been trying to reach you for several weeks." I said, "I do not know anyone named Margaret Clausen." He said, "She was your great-aunt, your grandmother's sister. She passed away about 4 months ago." I vaguely remembered hearing something about a great-aunt, a distant relative I had never met. I said, "I am sorry to hear that, but I do not see what that has to do with me." He said, "She left you something in her will. Quite a substantial inheritance, actually. I have been trying to contact you, but the address I had on file was your old house, and my letters were returned. I finally tracked you down through your employer." I stared at him. An inheritance. It seemed impossible, like something out of a novel. I said, "How much?" He said, "Can we go somewhere to talk? Perhaps a coffee shop. I have documents I need you to review and sign." We went to a small diner a few blocks from the library. It was one of those old-fashioned places with red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner. We sat down, and he pulled a stack of papers from his satchel. He explained that my great-aunt, Margaret, had been a successful businesswoman, that she had invested wisely over the years, and that she had no children of her own. She had left the bulk of her estate to various charities, but she had also left a significant sum to me, her great-niece, whom she had never met but had always been curious about. The amount was $250,000. I could not breathe. I could not speak. I just stared at the number on the page, at the zeros that seemed to multiply before my eyes. David Brennan smiled gently. He said, "I know it is a lot to take in. She wanted you to have a chance, a fresh start. She wrote a letter to accompany the inheritance. I have it here." He handed me an envelope. I opened it with shaking hands. The letter was written in elegant, old-fashioned script. It said, "Dear Elena, we never met, but I have always known of you. I followed your life from a distance, and I was proud of the woman you became. I know that life is not always kind, and I hope that this gift will give you the freedom to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be. Do not waste it on regret. Do not waste it on bitterness. Use it to build a life that makes you happy. With love, Margaret." I read the letter 3 times. Tears blurred my vision. I looked up at David Brennan, and he was smiling. He said, "She was a remarkable woman. I think she would be pleased to know that her gift is going to someone who needs it." I said, "I do not know what to say." He said, "You do not have to say anything. Just sign the papers, and the money will be transferred to your account within a few days." I signed the papers. My hand was shaking so badly that my signature was barely legible. But David did not seem to mind. He gathered the documents, stood up, and shook my hand. He said, "Good luck, Elena. I hope this brings you peace." And then he was gone, and I was left sitting in the diner, holding the letter, feeling as if the universe had reached down and given me a lifeline just when I thought I was going to drown. The money changed everything. It did not erase the pain, did not undo the betrayal, did not bring Richard back or make me want him back. But it gave me options. It gave me breathing room. It gave me the chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. I paid off my medical bills, which had been piling up despite the insurance. I paid my rent 6 months in advance. I bought a decent car to replace the ancient sedan that had been on its last legs. And then I did something I had always wanted to do, but never had the courage or the resources to attempt. I went back to school. I had always loved books, loved stories, loved the way words could build entire worlds. I had wanted to be a writer when I was younger, but life had gotten in the way. Marriage, work, the daily grind of survival. I had put my dreams on hold, and then I had forgotten they existed. But now, with the inheritance, with the space to breathe and think and imagine, I remembered. I enrolled in a graduate program in creative writing at the State University. It was a 2-year program, and I threw myself into it with a ferocity that surprised me. I wrote about betrayal. I wrote about loss. I wrote about survival. I wrote about women who were discarded and forgotten and who found a way to rebuild themselves from the ashes. I wrote late into the night, fueled by coffee and anger and hope. My professors were encouraging. My classmates were supportive. I started to feel like I was someone again, like I had a purpose, like I was more than just the woman whose husband had brought flowers to the hospital for someone else. 2 years passed. I graduated with honors. I published my first short story in a literary magazine, and then another, and then another. I started working on a novel, a sprawling, messy, beautiful story about a woman who loses everything and finds herself in the process. It poured out of me page after page, word after word. It was the most honest thing I'd ever written. During those 2 years, I heard things about Richard and Vanessa. It was a small town, and people talked. They had moved in together almost immediately after the divorce. They had gotten engaged 6 months later. They had a big, expensive wedding at a country club, the kind of wedding I had always wanted, but Richard had said was too extravagant. I heard that Vanessa was pregnant, that they were expecting a baby, that Richard was over the moon. I heard all of it, and I felt nothing. No jealousy, no anger, no regret. They were living their life, and I was living mine, and those two lives no longer intersected. I ran into Richard once, about 3 years after the divorce. I was at a coffee shop near the university, working on my novel, when he walked in. He was alone. He looked older, tired, the glow I had seen in the lawyer's office long gone. He saw me, and for a moment, he just stood there, frozen. Then he walked over. He said, "Elena, hi." I said, "Hello, Richard." He said, "You look good, really good." I said, "Thank you." He shifted his weight, awkward, uncertain. He said, "I heard you went back to school. That is great. I always knew you were smart." I said, "How are you? How is Vanessa?" His face changed. The mask slipped for just a
casually. The Morvent's translator struggled with whatever sounds he made next. Finally, it settled on, "If you survived, then the historical record regarding the incursion's conclusion is fundamentally inaccurate." The historical record is a carefully constructed narrative designed to let everyone feel good about how the war ended, Reiko corrected. The truth is that 77 humans spent 18 months doing things that violated every ethical guideline your species had established. We did it efficiently. We did it brutally. And we did it because every alternative involved extinction for billions of sentients who were very concerned about maintaining moral high ground right up until the Veil started glassing inhabited planets. "You're describing war crimes," the Thelian said. "I'm describing pragmatism. The Veil didn't have a central government to negotiate with, didn't have logistical vulnerabilities to exploit, didn't have anything except distributed leadership and absolute certainty in their supremacy." Reiko leaned back, and something about her posture suggested she'd had this argument before. "So we removed the leadership, all of it, every coordinator, every tactical mind, every individual who made the Veil function as a unified threat. 143 specific eliminations over 6 months. After that, they were just scattered raiders instead of an organized extinction event." Veksha watched her colleagues process this. The Thelian's chromatophores cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching horror. The Morvent's numerical processing centers were probably trying to calculate whether this information justified reopening historical analyses or burying it deeper. "Why reveal this now?" the Morvent asked. "Why risk destabilizing post-war diplomatic relationships?" "Because my granddaughter is training at your academy, and she deserves to know what humans actually contributed instead of the sanitized version where we played supporting roles in someone else's victory." Reiko's expression hardened. "And because in about 15 years, something else will come along that doesn't fit your tactical models. When that happens, you'll need people who understand that survival sometimes requires stepping outside the boundaries of what's comfortable." "That's indoctrination," the Thelian said. "That's education." Reiko glanced off-screen at something. "The difference being that indoctrination teaches you what to think, while education teaches you what's actually required. My unit learned the second thing. Your academy teaches the first. Which approach do you think produces better survival rates when reality stops cooperating with your lesson plans? The room settled into uncomfortable silence. Outside, cadets ran drills. Inside, 3 instructors confronted a ghost who refused to stay buried and had no interest in apologizing for breathing. "The commandant will need to be informed," Veksha said finally. "Already?"
Complete. One evening, I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sun set over the water. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and the air was warm and smelled of summer. I was holding a cup of tea, and Margaret was curled up on my lap, purring softly. I thought about the hospital room, about the flowers, about the moment when my life had shattered into 1,000 pieces. I thought about the pain and the loneliness and the fear. And then I thought about everything that had come after. The inheritance, the writing, the novel, the letters from readers, the quiet contentment of a life lived on my own terms. I realized that I was happy, not the loud, exuberant happiness of a person who had won something, but the deep, steady happiness of a person who had survived and healed and found herself on the other side. The flowers had not been for me, but the life I had built afterward, the life I was living now, that was mine. And it was enough.